Welcome to Lesson 8, Writing Accessible HTML. In this lesson, you'll be walked through the process step by step of inserting properly formatted elements into the body of an HTML document. Now, specifically in this lesson, we're going to continue learning the visible elements to site visitors, elements in the body portion of your HTML document. And in this lesson, we'll be specifically looking at HTML forms and how to code them properly and for accessibility. Now, we're not going to be worrying about connecting your form to a working script to process your form input at this time. For now, we just want to make sure to get the HTML correct for the form elements we want to display on our website. So first, let's look at the form tag. So here we have our body element that's opened and closed properly. We have our heading opened and closed properly with some content that's showing here on the page. We have our paragraph explaining what it is that's happening. Send us your information so we can assist. Properly opened and closed. And here's our form tag that I mentioned. So the form tag must be closed in order to be proper HTML. So we have our form tag opening here and closing here. Now the form tag also must have an action attribute to be valid HTML. That attribute shown is required, along with a path to the server-side script that will be processing the information submitted in your form. Now in this case, this is a PHP script. I've just thrown in a random name. We're not going to be covering PHP scripting in this course, so your form does not have to process input in order to complete the requirements of learning the attributes and tags and accessibility aspects of this lesson on building HTML forms. So next we have an input tag. Input tags are self-closing. An input tag is provided to give the site visitor a field into which to enter their name in this case. Input tags, as I said, don't have a closing tag. So notice there are really three items added to this form tag to create this basic form. We have an input for name. That's the name field down here. We have an input for email. And we have an input that is a submit type, which is the button. So let me go through these one by one. Starting with label for name. Label tag. This is added to tie the purpose of the field and its value together. This aids in both accessibility and usability as it adds semantic meaning to the input field. The for attribute is provided for accessibility purposes. The value provided between the quotes will be matched with the value of the ID attribute for the associated input tag. Notice here, the for attribute equals name, label for name. The input ID is name. So these two are associated together. We have some content here to display on the page, which is the label over here on the left of the field. And the label is properly closed. Input tag is properly closed because it doesn't require a closing tag. I've added two HTML line breaks simply to provide space visually for this demonstration. So input ID name, type equals text. This is the actual form field into which a site visitor will type information. So the label provides you with essentially the label here. The input text type provides you the input field here. So notice again how the ID attribute on this input tag matches the for attribute on the label tag. These two matching items are required for accessibility purposes as the input field now has a label and makes sense to a screen reader for visually impaired site visitors. There are many values that can be used in the type attribute. In this case, we're using the standard text type, which displays a basic form field into which text can be typed. The name attribute can be any value that you want. So if you wanted to add a name attribute to your input tag, so input, we have an ID attribute that equals name, we have a type attribute that equals text, and we could have a name attribute as well. We're not going to use a name attribute in this particular demonstration, but that is another attribute for input tags you can use. The label, the email input text field is basically essentially coded exactly the same as the name input text field. So we have label for email with our email label that's displayed down here. and the proper closing of the label tag. We have our input tag with its ID attribute that equals email, so the for and ID attributes match and are now associated. The type equals text, so we see a text field. 2 line breaks, which gives us another bit of space. And then input type equals submit. The submit type is understood by all browsers and assistive technologies as a button. The value you provide will be the text that is placed or displayed on the button. So notice I have a capital submit here under value, and that's why the capital S is here on the submit button. If I change this value, it will change the text on the submit button. Now, just a little bit of additional benefit for usability as well as for accessibility. When you associate a label with its for attribute to the input ID attribute and you match them, then the label can be clicked upon and activate the field. I can click upon the email label and the field is activated. So for assistive technology purposes, for end users that have maybe motor function impairments or limitations, or use assistive physical technologies to tab between elements on the page, having the label associated with the input field makes it easier to use. That's just an additional benefit that it provides, while also making it more easy to use for screen reader software and users with visual impairments. So I encourage you to look more into the form tag and its associated label and input fields. There are many other types of fields that can be placed into a form. For the purposes of this demonstration and this video, I'm only showing you a couple of input fields that are text types. They can get much more complicated than this, and there are many other aspects of forms that can be used.